My family had just finished telling everyone at Dad's birthday party how disappointed they were in their daughter who worked some low-level desk job at the naval base, when Admiral Richardson walked in and snapped to attention. "Fleet Commander Matthews, ma'am," he said with a crisp salute that silenced the entire room. "My name is Sarah Matthews, and this is how one moment changed everything." The Riverside Country Club ballroom had been transformed into what my mother called an elegant celebration befitting a man of your father's stature. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in navy blue linens, each centerpiece a carefully arranged bouquet of white roses and gold ribbons. The guest list read like a who's who of Charleston's business elite: bank presidents, real estate moguls, retired politicians, and their perfectly polished wives. This was the world I'd grown up in, where success was measured in square footage and stock portfolios, where the right connections mattered more than character, and where image was everything. The Matthews family had built their reputation over 3 generations in commercial real estate, and every detail of tonight's party was designed to remind everyone of that legacy. My father, William Matthews, held court near the bar in his custom-tailored Navy suit, a glass of top-shelf bourbon in his hand. At 65, he still commanded every room he entered with the kind of presence that came from never being told no. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, his posture straight as a board, and his laugh, the one he used for impressing clients, echoed across the room at regular intervals. My mother, Patricia, floated between tables in her designer gown, playing the perfect hostess role she'd mastered over 40 years of marriage. Her smile never wavered. Her conversations flowed seamlessly from weather to mutual acquaintances to subtle brags about the family business. She had turned social networking into an art form, and tonight was her masterpiece. My older brother, Marcus, stood near the entrance greeting guests with his wife, Jennifer. Both lawyers at prestigious firms, they represented everything my parents had hoped their children would become. Marcus wore success like his expensive watch, visible and impressive. Jennifer's diamond tennis bracelet caught the light every time she gestured, and their conversation centered around their recent acquisition of a beach house in Kiowa Island. The unspoken rule in the Matthews family was simple: we were winners, and winners didn't associate with anything that might tarnish the family name. We donated to the right charities, belonged to the right clubs, and married the right people. Failure wasn't just discouraged, it was incomprehensible. I had been the exception to every rule they'd carefully constructed. While Marcus followed the predetermined path from prep school to Ivy League to law firm partnership, I had chosen a different route entirely. After college, when they expected me to join the family business or marry someone who could enhance our social standing, I had enlisted in the Navy. The decision had sent shockwaves through their perfectly ordered world. Military service, in their minds, was something other people's children did. People who needed structure, people who couldn't afford better options, people who weren't destined for country club memberships in corner offices. For 8 years, I had been the family's quiet disappointment. They never said it directly, of course. The Matthews family was too polished for outright confrontation. Instead, it came through in carefully worded introductions at social gatherings, deflected questions about my career, and the way conversation shifted whenever someone asked about their daughter. Tonight, I sat at a table near the back, close enough to be present, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention to what they saw as their one failure. I wore my best civilian dress, a simple black cocktail dress that wouldn't embarrass them but wouldn't draw focus either. To everyone in this room, I was Sarah, the Matthews daughter who had somehow lost her way, working some unclear government job that nobody really understood or cared to ask about. The trouble started during the cocktail hour, when Mrs. Wellington, one of my mother's closest friends, approached our family's table with her usual predatory smile. She had perfected the art of asking invasive questions while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. "Patricia, darling," she began, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure nearby tables could overhear. "I was just telling my husband about how proud you must be of Marcus's latest case. That pharmaceutical settlement was front-page news in the Post and Courier. My mother beamed, launching into a detailed account of my brother's legal triumph while Marcus stood straighter, clearly enjoying the attention. Jennifer added commentary about how the victory had attracted interest from firms in New York and Atlanta, each detail carefully chosen to impress. Then Mrs. Wellington's gaze shifted to me with theatrical curiosity. "And Sarah, dear, how are things at what is it you do again, something with the military?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I could feel the weight of multiple conversations pausing, ears tuning in to hear how the Matthews family would handle their problematic daughter. "Sarah works at the naval base," my mother replied quickly, her tone suggesting we should move on to more interesting topics. "It's very stable work." The way she said stable made it sound like a consolation prize, something you settled for when you couldn't achieve anything better. Mr. Hartwell, a prominent banker and my father's golf partner, chimed in with what he probably thought was helpful enthusiasm. "Oh, the Charleston Naval Base. My nephew did some contract work there. Mostly administrative stuff, right? Filing, data entry, that sort of thing?" Before I could respond, my father stepped in with the explanation he'd perfected over the years. "Sarah's in logistics," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Paperwork, mostly. Government work, you know how it is. Not much room for advancement, but the benefits are decent." The condescension in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. He made it sound like I was a clerk who'd stumbled into a dead-end job and was too comfortable to leave. Marcus decided to add his own perspective, because apparently the family humiliation wasn't complete yet. "The thing about government work," he said, swirling his wine like he was delivering wisdom from on high, "is that it's fine if you don't have ambition. Some people are content with mediocrity." Jennifer nodded sympathetically. "It must be nice not having the pressure of client expectations or performance reviews. Very low stress." I gripped my water glass tighter, feeling the familiar knot forming in my stomach. This was how it always went. They would systematically diminish everything I'd worked for, reduce 8 years of service to a boring desk job that required no skill or dedication. Mrs. Wellington's smile grew wider, sensing blood in the water. "Well, not everyone can be a high achiever like Marcus. Some people are just meant for simpler lives." The conversations around us had now completely stopped. Other guests were openly listening, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging glances that said they understood exactly what kind of disappointment I represented to the Matthews family. My mother quickly tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. The narrative had been established for anyone who might have missed it over the years. Sarah Matthews was the family failure, the daughter who'd chosen an easy path and settled for less. As dinner was served, the attacks became more pointed and personal. My father had clearly had enough bourbon to loosen his filter, and what started as casual dismissal evolved into something crueler. "You know what the real tragedy is?" he announced to the table, his voice carrying to nearby guests. "Sarah had every advantage we could give her. Private schools, tutors, college, paid for in full. We handed her opportunities most people only dream of." He gestured toward Marcus with obvious pride. "Look at what Marcus did with those same advantages. Partnership track at 28, building his own legacy. But some people," his eyes found mine, "some people just throw it all away for a uniform and a government pension." Mrs. Wellington leaned forward with false sympathy. "It must be so difficult, watching your daughter waste her potential like that." My mother's response cut deeper than my father's bluntness. "We've learned to accept it," she said with a resigned sigh. "Sarah has always been different. She never quite fit in with our crowd. I suppose the military attracts people who need that kind of structure because they can't succeed in the real world." The words hit like physical blows. She was essentially telling everyone that I was damaged goods, someone who couldn't compete in their sophisticated world, so I'd run away to hide in the military. Jennifer, emboldened by wine and the supportive audience, decided to add her perspective. "It's actually kind of sad," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "I mean, all those years in the Navy, and what does she have to show for it? Still living in that tiny apartment, no husband, no real career prospects when she gets out. At her age, Marcus was already making partner." The comparison stung because it was designed to. At 32, I was apparently behind schedule in their predetermined timeline of success. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The fact that I owned my apartment outright, that I had savings, that I'd traveled the world and led teams through complex operations, none of that registered as success in their narrow definition. Mr. Hartwell, feeling the need to contribute his own wisdom, pointed his fork at me like a professor making a point. The problem with military service is that it doesn't translate to civilian success. You get comfortable taking orders instead of giving them. It's why so many veterans struggle to find good jobs after they get out. My father nodded gravely, as if this profound insight explained everything about my life choices. Exactly. Sarah's gotten too comfortable being told what to do. She's lost that entrepreneurial spirit, that drive to build something meaningful. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd inherited his father's business was lecturing me about entrepreneurial spirit while I sat there, having led operations that he couldn't even imagine. Marcus decided this was the perfect moment to deliver what he clearly thought was the final blow. The saddest part is that she could still turn things around. Dad would give her a position in the company tomorrow. Hell, with her military background, she'd probably be good at managing the maintenance staff or something. The condescension was breathtaking. He was offering me a job managing janitors like it was a generous gift, a way to rescue me from my poor life choices. But she won't take it, my mother added with exasperation, too proud to admit she made a mistake. So she'll just keep filing paperwork at the Navy base until they force her to retire. Around the table, heads nodded in understanding. Here was a cautionary tale about the dangers of rejecting family wisdom and choosing your own path. I sat there, fork frozen halfway to my mouth, listening to my family systematically dismantle everything I'd worked for, everything I'd achieved, everything I was. The familiar shame began to creep up my throat, that old feeling of being the family disappointment, the one who'd never quite measured up to their expectations. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way Mrs. Wellington was practically salivating as she absorbed every detail of my supposed failure. Maybe it was watching Marcus puff up with superiority as he offered me a job managing maintenance staff. Or maybe it was the realization that these people, my own family, knew absolutely nothing about who I really was or what I'd accomplished. I thought about last Tuesday, when I'd briefed the Joint Chiefs on Pacific Fleet readiness, about the commendation letter in my office from the Secretary of the Navy, about the 300 sailors under my command who looked to me for leadership in some of the most complex naval operations in the world. I thought about the missions I couldn't discuss, the decisions I'd made that affected national security, the respect I'd earned from admirals and generals whose names these country club guests would recognize if they bothered to pay attention to anything beyond their golf handicaps and stock portfolios. For 8 years, I'd let them believe their version of my story. When they asked vague questions about my work, I'd given vague answers. When they assumed I was just another cog in the military machine, I'd let them assume. It had seemed easier than trying to explain clearance levels and operational security to people who thought success only came in the form of billable hours and real estate deals. But as I sat there listening to Jennifer wonder aloud what I'd do when I aged out of my little military phase, something inside me snapped, not with anger, but with clarity. I realized I'd been protecting them from the truth, not because they couldn't handle it, but because I'd been afraid of their reaction, afraid they'd find some way to diminish even my actual accomplishments, afraid they'd make my success about them somehow, or worse, that they still wouldn't think it was enough. But watching them tear me down in front of their friends, using me as entertainment for their social gathering, I understood something fundamental. Their approval had never been worth having in the first place. These people measured worth by how much money you made and what neighborhood you lived in. They'd never understand that I'd chosen service over profit, that I'd prioritized mission accomplishment over personal gain, that I'd found meaning in something bigger than myself. The woman they were describing, the failed daughter hiding in a dead-end government job, that wasn't me. That was the story they'd created to make sense of choices they couldn't comprehend. I thought about my team back at the base, the men and women who trusted my judgment in life or death situations. I thought about the operations we'd successfully completed, the lives we'd saved, the threats we'd neutralized. I thought about the admiral who'd told me just last week that I was being considered for one of the most prestigious commands in the Navy. The shame dissolved, replaced by something I hadn't felt in my family's presence for years: pride. Not the shallow pride they valued, the kind that came from impressing strangers at cocktail parties, but real pride in work that mattered. I set down my fork and looked around the table with new eyes. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going to protect them from the truth. The final straw came during the birthday toast. My father stood up, tapping his crystal glass with a silver knife, commanding the attention of the entire ballroom. The conversations died down as 150 guests turned their focus to the patriarch of the Matthews family. "Friends, thank you all for being here tonight," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. 65 years on this earth, and I can honestly say I'm blessed beyond measure. He gestured toward my mother with practiced charm. "Patricia, my beautiful wife of 40 years, who's made every success possible." Polite applause rippled through the room. "Marcus, my son, who's already surpassed his old man in achievement and is building a legacy that will last generations." More applause, louder this time. Marcus stood slightly, acknowledging the recognition with a modest nod that fooled no one. Then my father's eyes found me, and I could see the calculation behind them. He was deciding, in real time, how to handle the family disappointment during his moment of triumph. "And Sarah," he paused, the silence stretching just long enough to be uncomfortable, "who reminds us that not every path leads to the same destination, but every child teaches us something about love and acceptance." The diplomatic non-compliment drew sympathetic nods from the crowd. He'd managed to acknowledge my existence while simultaneously reinforcing that I was the family's burden to bear, their lesson in unconditional love, despite disappointment. Mrs. Wellington actually made a small IREWW sound, as if my father had just demonstrated remarkable grace in the face of adversity. But he wasn't finished. The bourbon had loosened his tongue, and apparently he'd decided this was the perfect moment for some brutal honesty disguised as paternal wisdom. "You know, when your children are young, you have such big dreams for them," he continued, his voice taking on a wistful tone. "You imagine they'll follow in your footsteps, maybe even exceed what you've accomplished. Sometimes that happens." He smiled at Marcus. "And sometimes you learn that love means accepting when they choose simpler lives." The word simpler hung in the air like a slap. Around the room, I could see people nodding with understanding, probably thinking about their own disappointments, their own children who hadn't lived up to expectations. Jennifer leaned over and whispered loudly enough for the table to hear, "At least she's not in trouble or anything. Some families aren't even that lucky." My mother reached across the table and patted my hand with exaggerated sympathy. "We're proud of Sarah for finding her place, even if it's not what we expected." That's when I felt my phone buzz. A text from my aide, "Admiral Richardson arriving now. Says it's urgent. Where should I direct him?" I stared at the message, my heart rate quickening. Admiral Richardson didn't make social calls, and he definitely didn't track me down at family events unless something significant was happening. The only reason he'd be here was if there was a crisis that required immediate command attention. I texted back quickly, "Riverside Country Club, main ballroom. Family event." My father was still speaking, moving into the final portion of his toast about family values and the importance of maintaining standards, when I saw him. Admiral Richardson appeared in the ballroom doorway in full dress uniform, his aide beside him, scanning the room with military precision. The timing couldn't have been more perfect, or more devastating, depending on your perspective. Admiral Richardson's eyes swept the ballroom until they found me. Without hesitation, he began walking directly toward our table, his polished dress shoes clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet room. My father was mid-sentence in his toast, something about accepting our children's limitations with grace, when he noticed the uniformed figure approaching. His words trailed off as every head in the ballroom turned to follow the Admiral's purposeful stride. The silence was deafening. 150 of Charleston's elite watched as a three-star admiral in full military dress uniform made his way across the room with obvious intent. The The gold braiding on his uniform caught the chandelier light, and the ribbons on his chest told the story of a distinguished career that even these civilians could recognize as impressive. Mrs. Wellington's mouth fell open slightly. Mr. Hartwell set down his bourbon glass. Even Marcus and Jennifer straightened in their chairs, suddenly aware that something significant was happening. Admiral Richardson stopped directly behind my chair. In one fluid motion, he came to attention and rendered a crisp military salute. "Fleet Commander Matthews, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom. "I apologize for interrupting your family gathering, but we have a situation developing in the South China Sea that requires your immediate attention." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if the entire room had collectively stopped breathing. Forks hung suspended halfway to mouths. Wine glasses froze in midair. Even the servers stopped moving. "Fleet Commander." The words reverberated through the ballroom like a physical force. Not lieutenant, not petty officer, not some vague logistics position that my family had dismissed for 8 years. "Fleet Commander." I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the floor in the profound quiet. "What's the situation, Admiral?" I asked, my voice steady and professional. "Chinese naval vessels have moved into disputed waters near Taiwan. The President has been briefed, and the Joint Chiefs are requesting your assessment of our response options. The Pacific Fleet is awaiting your orders." "The Pacific Fleet is awaiting your orders." My father's face had gone completely white. His mouth opened and closed like he was trying to speak, but no words would come. The crystal glass in his hand trembled slightly. My mother stared at me as if I were a stranger. Her perfectly composed expression had crumbled into confusion and shock. Marcus looked like someone had just told him the laws of physics had been suspended. Jennifer's diamond tennis bracelet caught the light as her hand flew to cover her mouth. Around the room, 150 guests sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they were witnessing. The Matthews family disappointment, the daughter who worked a simple government job, who had wasted her potential, who was content with mediocrity, was apparently someone important enough that a 3-star admiral tracked her down at a birthday party to personally deliver urgent national security briefings. Mrs. Wellington made a small choking sound. Admiral Richardson remained at attention, waiting for my response with the kind of respect that told everyone in the room exactly who was in charge of this situation. "I'll need 15 minutes to brief my family, then I'll follow you back to base," I said calmly. "Yes, ma'am, my car is waiting outside." The Admiral turned and walked back toward the entrance, leaving behind a ballroom full of people who suddenly realized they had no idea who Sarah Matthews really was. I turned back to face my family's table, where 4 pairs of eyes stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something that might have been fear. The rest of the ballroom remained frozen, every guest straining to hear what would happen next. "So," I said quietly, my voice carrying in the absolute silence, "I think we need to address a few misconceptions." My father's mouth moved soundlessly before he finally managed to croak, "Fleet Commander?" "Yes, Dad, Fleet Commander, not a clerk. Not someone filing paperwork in a dead-end job. I command the 3rd Fleet's Pacific Operations Division. 300 sailors, 12 ships, and a budget that's probably larger than your entire company's annual revenue." Mrs. Wellington made another small choking sound. I turned to address her directly. "You asked about advancement opportunities in government work? I've been promoted 6 times in 8 years. I'm the youngest fleet commander in the Pacific Theater, and I'm being considered for admiral at 32. I looked at Marcus, who was still staring at me like I'd grown a second head. "You offered me a job managing maintenance staff?" "That's interesting, because last month I was briefing the Secretary of Defense on naval readiness. The month before that, I was coordinating joint operations with Australian and Japanese naval forces. But sure, I'll keep that maintenance position in mind for when I retire." Jennifer's diamond bracelet caught the light as her hand trembled. I smiled at her with the same fake sweetness she'd been using all evening. "You are worried about my career prospects when I leave the military? I've already received offers from 3 defense contractors and 2 consulting firms. Starting salaries that would make your husband's partnership income look like an allowance." The silence stretched until my mother finally found her voice. "But you never said, you let us think." I let you think what you wanted to think, I replied. When you asked about my work, I told you I couldn't discuss operational details. When you assumed I was unimportant, I didn't correct you. When you made me your cautionary tale about wasted potential, I stayed quiet. I turned to my father, whose face had progressed from white to an alarming shade of gray. You talked about throwing away advantages, about lacking entrepreneurial spirit. Dad, I've led rescue operations in hostile waters. I've made split-second decisions that affected international relations. I've commanded resources and personnel in situations where failure meant people died. But you're right, I should probably be more like Marcus and argue about billable hours instead. Marcus finally found his voice. Why didn't you tell us? Because, I said, my voice rising slightly for the first time, everything I do is classified at levels you don't have clearance to understand. Because I took an oath to put service before self, which means I don't get to brag about my achievements at cocktail parties. And because I learned a long time ago that your approval was never about my success anyway. I gestured toward the Admiral's retreating figure. That man flew here personally because when there's a crisis in the Pacific, they call me. Not my staff, not my supervisor, me. Because the President and the Joint Chiefs trust my judgment. I looked around the table one final time, so no, I don't need you to accept my simple life anymore. I need to go prevent a potential international incident. Try not to worry too much about my career prospects. I walked away from the table with my head held high, leaving behind a ballroom full of stunned faces and whispered conversations that were just beginning to erupt. Behind me, I could hear my mother's voice, shaky and confused, trying to explain to Mrs. Wellington what had just happened, as if she understood it herself. The Admiral waited by the entrance, his expression neutral but professional. As I approached, he fell into step beside me, and we walked out of the country club into the warm Charleston evening. Ma'am, he said quietly as we reached his waiting car, I apologize for the timing. I had no idea we were interrupting a family celebration. I paused with my hand on the car door handle, looking back at the club's elegant facade. Through the tall windows, I could see the ballroom still buzzing with activity, guests clustered in animated conversations, probably dissecting every word of what they'd just witnessed. Actually, Admiral, your timing was perfect, I said, sliding into the passenger seat. During the 15-minute drive to the naval base, my phone started buzzing incessantly, text after text from numbers I recognized. My mother, Marcus, even Jennifer. I let them pile up, unread. Whatever they had to say could wait until after I'd dealt with the situation in the South China Sea. The crisis itself turned out to be more of a diplomatic probe than an actual threat. Chinese vessels testing boundaries, pushing to see how we'd respond. 3 hours of secure communications with fleet commanders, intelligence briefings, and coordination with allied forces resulted in a measured response that sent the appropriate message without escalating tensions. By the time I finally returned to my apartment at nearly midnight, I had 47 missed calls and 63 text messages. I poured myself a glass of wine and finally started reading through them. Marcus, Sarah, we need to talk. I had no idea. Call me. Jennifer, I'm so sorry. I feel terrible about what I said. Please forgive me. My mother, sweetheart, I don't understand why you kept this from us. We're your family. And then another from my mother, sent 2 hours later. Mrs. Wellington has been calling everyone we know. The whole club is talking. Why didn't you tell us who you really were? That last message stung more than I expected. Even after everything, her primary concern was how this affected their social standing. Not that she'd misjudged her own daughter for 8 years, but that other people now knew she'd been wrong. My father hadn't texted at all, which was somehow worse than if he'd sent angry messages or defensive explanations. I set my phone aside and walked out onto my apartment's small balcony, looking out over Charleston Harbor, the same harbor where my ships were docked, where my sailors were standing watch, where my responsibilities extended far beyond family drama and social expectations. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 8 years, I'd commanded respect from admirals, foreign military leaders, and government officials at the highest levels. But I'd never been able to command respect from my own family. Tonight had changed that, but not in the way I'd imagined it would when I was a child dreaming of making my parents proud. Instead of earning their approval through achievement, I'd had to force them to see achievements they'd refused to acknowledge. The satisfaction I felt wasn't the warm glow of family acceptance I'd once craved. It was colder, more distant, the satisfaction of finally being seen clearly, even if that clarity came too late. The first call came 3 days later. I was in my office reviewing operational reports when my aide knocked and informed me that my father was downstairs, asking to see me. No appointment, no advance warning. He'd simply shown up at the naval base and asked to speak with Fleet Commander Matthews. I found him in the visitors' waiting area, looking smaller somehow in his civilian clothes, surrounded by the military efficiency of the base. His usual commanding presence seemed diminished, and for the first time in my memory he looked uncertain. "Dad," I said, approaching cautiously, "this is unexpected." He stood awkwardly, his hands fidgeting with his car keys. "I tried calling, but you weren't answering. I needed to see you." I led him to a small conference room where we could talk privately. He sat across from me at the metal table, his eyes taking in the official photographs on the walls, pictures of me with various high-ranking officials, commendation ceremonies, fleet exercises I'd commanded. "I've spent the last 3 days reading about you," he said quietly. "Online articles, Navy publications, congressional testimony records. Did you know that Senator Harrison specifically mentioned your Pacific operations strategy in a Defense Committee hearing last year?" I nodded. I was there to testify. "To Congress. You testified to Congress." He shook his head slowly. "Sarah, I found an article in the Naval War College Review that you co-authored on fleet readiness protocols. It's been cited by defense experts around the world." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I called Admiral Richardson yesterday, asked if I could speak with him about your service record. Do you know what he told me?" I waited. "He said you were one of the finest naval officers of your generation, that your strategic thinking had prevented at least 2 potential conflicts from escalating, that foreign military leaders specifically request to work with you because of your reputation for excellence." His voice cracked slightly. "He said the Navy was lucky to have you, and that any father should be proud to call you his daughter." The words hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure how to cross. "I failed you," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "For 8 years, I failed to see who you really were because I was too busy being disappointed that you weren't who I wanted you to be." I felt something tight in my chest begin to loosen. "Dad?" "No, let me finish." He looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and tired. "I built my entire identity around the business, around providing for my family, around being successful in ways that other people could see and measure. When you chose the military, I saw it as a rejection of everything I'd worked for." He gestured toward the photographs on the wall. "I never bothered to learn what you actually did because I was convinced it couldn't possibly be as important as what I did. I was wrong. What you do matters more than anything I've ever accomplished." The next week, Marcus showed up at my apartment with coffee and an expression I'd never seen before: genuine humility. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, settling into my living room chair, "about making split-second decisions where failure meant people died. I realize that the biggest decision I make on any given day is which restaurant to choose for a client lunch." He was quiet for a moment. I looked up the Strait of Hormuz incident from 2 years ago, the one where tensions with Iran almost escalated into a shooting war, but somehow diplomatic channels stayed open long enough to resolve it peacefully. I remembered that week vividly: 72 hours of continuous operations, coordinating with multiple allied fleets, while managing increasingly aggressive Iranian naval posturing. "You were there, weren't you?" Marcus asked. "The reports mention an American fleet commander whose tactical positioning and communication protocols helped prevent the situation from exploding." I nodded. "Jesus, Sarah, while I was complaining about partnership politics, you were preventing a war." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I spent so many years thinking I was the successful one, the one making a real difference. But you've been out there actually protecting people, actually serving something bigger than yourself." He paused, struggling with words. "I'm ashamed of how I treated you. How we all treated you. You deserved better from your family." My mother's apology came in the form of a visit to the base, bringing lunch she'd prepared herself, something she hadn't done in years. She sat in my office, looking around at the maps, the secure communications equipment, the operational charts that covered one entire wall. "I keep thinking about all the times you tried to tell us," she said, unpacking containers of my favorite dishes from childhood. "All the times we asked about your work, and you said you couldn't discuss it. We thought you were making excuses." She touched one of the framed commendations on my desk. "Mrs. Wellington called me yesterday. She said her husband looked up what a fleet commander actually does. She wanted to apologize for what she said at the party." My mother's voice became softer. She also said that her nephew, the one who does contract work at the base, mentioned that everyone there talks about you with incredible respect, that people feel honored to serve under your command. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm sorry we made you feel like you had to choose between your family and your calling. I'm sorry we never bothered to understand how extraordinary you are." Even Jennifer reached out, sending a heartfelt email explaining how she'd spent days researching women in military leadership and had come to understand just how rare and impressive my position was. The reconciliation wasn't immediate or complete, but it was real. My family was learning to see me not as the daughter who'd disappointed them, but as the woman who'd found her purpose and excelled beyond their ability to measure or understand. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of the USS Charleston, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. The promotion ceremony was scheduled for 0800 hours, and dignitaries from 3 countries had assembled to witness what Admiral Richardson called a historic moment in naval leadership. Today, I would officially become the youngest Rear Admiral in the Pacific Fleet's history. My family stood in the VIP section, looking both proud and slightly overwhelmed by the gravity of the ceremony. My father wore his best suit and an expression of wonder that hadn't left his face since he'd first stepped aboard a modern naval vessel. My mother clutched a handkerchief, already emotional before the ceremony had even begun. Marcus and Jennifer had flown in from Atlanta, where he'd recently opened a new practice focused on veterans' legal advocacy, a career pivot inspired, he'd told me, by wanting to do work that actually mattered. They stood with their 2 young children, my nephew and niece, experiencing their first military ceremony. The irony of the setting wasn't lost on me. Here, surrounded by the instruments of American naval power, my family was finally seeing me in my element. Not as the daughter who'd failed to meet their expectations, but as the leader I'd become when I stopped trying to fit into their world and started building my own. Admiral Richardson approached the podium, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd of sailors, officers, and distinguished guests. "Today we gather to recognize not just exceptional service, but exceptional leadership. Rear Admiral Sarah Matthews has demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking, operational excellence, and moral courage that defines the very best of our naval tradition." He began reading the citation, detailing operations I'd led, crises I'd managed, innovations I'd implemented. Many of the specifics were still classified, reduced to vague references that barely hinted at the true scope of the work. But as he spoke, I watched my family's faces change, understanding slowly dawning about what my service had actually entailed. Her leadership during the Taiwan Strait crisis prevented what intelligence estimates suggest could have escalated into the largest naval conflict since World War II, Admiral Richardson continued. Her development of integrated Pacific defense protocols has become the new standard for Allied naval cooperation. Her mentorship of junior officers has shaped a generation of naval leaders. When he pinned the 2 stars to my uniform collar, the weight of them felt different than I'd expected. Not heavy with responsibility. I'd been carrying that responsibility for years, but significant in a way that had nothing to do with rank or recognition. After the ceremony, as guests mingled on the deck, my father approached me with that same wondering expression he'd worn all morning. "I still can't quite believe it," he said quietly. "My daughter, the Admiral." "Rear Admiral," I corrected with a smile. "But who's counting?" He laughed, a sound I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "Do you know what the proudest moment of my life was?" he asked. I waited, expecting him to mention Marcus's latest legal victory or some business achievement. "It was 10 minutes ago when that admiral was reading your citation, and the man standing next to me, some Pentagon official, leaned over and said, 'Your daughter is a legend in defense circles.'" We're lucky to have her." His voice caught slightly. "I realized that while I was building buildings, you were building peace." My mother joined us, her makeup slightly smudged from tears she'd tried to hide. "I've been thinking about something you said that night at the party," she began. "About how everything you do is classified, how you can't discuss operational details. I always thought that was an excuse." She looked out over the harbor, where several ships from my command were anchored in formation. "Now I understand. You've been protecting national secrets, making decisions that affect millions of people, and you couldn't even tell your own family because the work was too important to risk." "It wasn't about not trusting you," I said. "It was about not wanting to burden you with information that could put others at risk." Marcus approached with his son on his shoulders, my 5-year-old nephew wearing a tiny sailor hat someone had given him. "Aunt Sarah," the boy called out, "are you really in charge of all those big ships?" "Some of them," I said, lifting him down from Marcus's shoulders. "Want to see the bridge?" As we walked across the deck, my nephew's hand in mine, Marcus fell into step beside me. "I've been reading about the Naval War College," he said. "They want you to teach there next year, don't they?" "It's been discussed," I replied. "Advanced Strategic Studies. They want me to develop a new curriculum on Pacific theater operations." "From student to professor at the most prestigious military academy in the world," he mused. "Do you ever think about where you'd be if you'd taken Dad's advice and joined the family business instead?" I considered the question as we climbed to the bridge, where my crew was waiting to give my family a tour of the command center. "I'd probably be successful by conventional measures," I said. "Good salary, nice office, social status. But I wouldn't be who I am now." "And who are you now?" Marcus asked. I looked out at the Pacific, where my ships stood ready, where my sailors served with honor, where the decisions I made rippled across international waters and affected the delicate balance of global security. "I'm someone who knows the difference between success and significance," I said. "Success is about what you achieve for yourself. Significance is about what you achieve for others." That evening, my family joined me for dinner at the Officers' Club, a quiet celebration that felt more genuine than any country club gathering I'd ever attended. There were no performance conversations, no one trying to impress anyone else. Just family, finally comfortable with who we all really were. As the night wound down, my father raised his glass for a toast. "To Sarah," he said, his voice clear and proud, "who taught us that the most important victories are the ones nobody sees, and that true strength comes from serving something bigger than yourself." The words I'd waited my whole life to hear, finally spoken when I no longer needed them to define my worth. Sometimes the greatest distance you have to travel isn't measured in miles or years, but in understanding. It took my family 8 years to see who I really was, but it took me just as long to stop needing their vision to complete my own picture of myself. If this story touches something in you, know that your worth isn't determined by other people's ability to understand your path. Sometimes the most important work happens in silence. The greatest achievements go unrecognized, and the people who matter most are the last ones to see your value. But that doesn't make your contributions any less significant. Your life has meaning beyond other people's measurements. Trust that, even when the people closest to you don't understand it yet. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.